Just last week, my roommate sent me a letter all the way from the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station in Antarctica. So at first I thought I might have missed a rent payment, and that was a really strange way of sending that to me. But then I realized the significance of what he had done. The Amundsen Scott South Pole Station is smack dab in the middle of Antarctica, 1,000 miles away from the closest piece of civilization. And it took probably over 3 flights over at least 3 continents in order to get to me. So if that's not the most challenging piece of terrestrial logistics I've ever seen, then what is? So I figured if we can send a postcard all the way from the South Pole to Los Angeles, then we should be able to leverage those lessons and apply this to transportation in space. And so I work at a company called Impulse Space, where we work on space logistics as a whole, but have a strong focus on in-space transportation services. And I thought, we don't want to just develop the technologies. We want to work at a higher level and think about the future architectures. What better way to do that than by looking back on Earth and learning from our commercial airlines? If you didn't know this, back in the mid-20th century, Delta Airlines pioneered the hub and spoke model, where they started creating commercial airline hubs at major cities like Atlanta, which had 94 million passengers going through just in one single year. Los Angeles, New York, Chicago. Instead of having single flights going from all of these cities, even the tiny cities, you have major hubs connected by high traffic, high volume flights, and regional flights that then distribute these passengers to the smaller cities. With this efficient system, Delta remains one of the largest airlines today. And if you can transport humans this efficiently across the United States and the world, why not apply the same model to transporting cargo? That's exactly what FedEx did in 1970. They have hubs and spokes, very similar to airlines. And for their hubs, they have a fleet of delivery vehicles that pick up from the shippers and then deliver them to the final customer. But in between these hubs, they have high volume, high efficiency 18-wheelers and cargo planes that transport these across the country in order to create a very efficient system of getting anything from letters to huge packages anywhere in the country and the world. Let's apply this now to space. If we just remove some of these with their space analogs, you can get a very similar picture. Instead of having a package hub, you now have a payload integration site, say at Cape Canaveral, where we might be launching many of our rockets. After you integrate these payloads, you now need to deliver them to orbit. And many times they go to a parking orbit where they may sit and perform their final mission. But in many cases today, these customers don't end up where they want to go. And so they need that fleet of delivery trucks. But in this case, it's going to be orbital transfer vehicles, which then can take you to the final destination that you want to go to. If you take this even a level further, your orbital transfer vehicles don't want to just go on a one-way trip and then become space trash. You want to add refueling capability so that you can perform frequent trips to pick up customers at this parking orbit where you might have frequent launch vehicle deliveries in the future, and then be able to deliver them to the final orbit multiple times. You might also not want to just go to a final orbit. We're talking about deep space exploration here. So in order to have a sustainable way of traveling to these other planets and being able to come back multiple times, you might also want landers to go to the surface, as well as ascent vehicles in the future. So we're starting to see the creation of a truly sustainable end-to-end transportation infrastructure in space, which is what we need in order to move forward into the future. But there's many challenges that remain today. Here on Earth, we're a little bit spoiled. We can get on-demand delivery of pretty much anything that you need just by clicking a button on the internet. I'm guilty of having ordered even a 15-pound bag of rice when I ran out one day, and it came the same day. That's pretty insane. But you don't have that same luxury in space. If you had a satellite ready, and say you want to book a launch for the following month, if you go to the launch provider and you ask, all right, when's the cutoff date to get on to next month's launch? If you work in this industry, you probably know that was something like 2 years ago. A little bit late. But we're getting a lot better at shortening this timeline down. In fact, there's even a government program that's trying to get satellites to be launched on demand within 24 hours, known as tactically responsive space. So this 2-year timeline is still going to remain because there's reason for that. Integration and testing takes time. But we're making rapid progress in addressing this issue. There's also the problem of supply chain. If you've looked at the gas prices in the past few years, they've been pretty high and might make you rethink taking that cross-country road trip around the United States. In space, we're still susceptible to the same types of issues. When Russia invaded Ukraine, they severely impacted the neon, krypton, and xenon supply chain market. They're one of the major producers in the world. And on satellites, they use Hall effect thrusters to do a lot of the orbit maneuvers, orbit station keeping in order to operate your satellites. And now, if we have a supply chain crunch, you might add tens to hundreds of millions of dollars to your costs of mega constellations that are going into orbit. And in fact, SpaceX just announced on Twitter 2 weeks ago that they swapped from their first generation Krypton Hall thrusters to second generation Argon thrusters, which are slightly lower performance, but now you have access to the abundant and low-cost argon propellant, which is a very fair trade to make these days. And finally, the last challenge I want to talk about is that of packing efficiency. So if you've ever ordered something very small from Amazon, like a toothbrush, I've done that once. They gave me a box this big for a single toothbrush, and I have no idea how that happened. But this packing efficiency problem still happens for space as well. Not only do you not fill up the volume of the fairing, which isn't that big a deal, actually, you're not using the full mass capability to the orbit that you're going to. This NASA IXPE mission, Imaging X-ray Polarimetry Explorer in 2021, not to poke fun at NASA, but they had a high priority to get this up there, and they used 20% of the payload capacity they could send to this equatorial LEO destination. 80% of that could have gone to another customer. And so we're getting a lot better at addressing this challenge as well. You may be very familiar with the picture on the left. I call it the Frankenstein Christmas tree of satellites, because there's satellites of all shapes and sizes that you then aggregate into a single launch vehicle in order to maximize the amount of volume that you use, but also the payload mass capability to a given orbit. And that's the SpaceX Transporter mission on the left. In addition to being a lot more efficient at aggregation, we're also seeing reusability and launch start to drop the cost of access to space. We started with about $85,000 per kilogram with the space shuttle in the 1980s. That's gone down almost 2 orders of magnitude to a few $1,000s per kilogram in modern day with commercial launch vehicles. That's a substantial decrease in the activation energy in order to get something into space and opened up the market to many different players. So with these major improvements in space transportation, we're starting to see the realization of some of these hubs in space. So just a quick look at orbit. Geocentric equatorial orbit is always going to remain popular for communication satellites, imaging satellites. We have the ISS in a 51-degree, 400-kilometer inclination orbit, where we still have frequent deliveries of cargo and astronauts. But most interestingly to me, I've seen LEO sun-synchronous orbit, SSO, which is a near-polar orbit, become a major hub of commercial and government activity. With these transporter missions launching hundreds of small sats to the same orbit, some of them are starting to realize that they need to go to other orbits as well, which created a market for orbital transfer vehicles to then distribute them to different altitudes, inclinations, and planes. We're also expanding beyond the Earth. Our transportation infrastructure is reaching the Moon and Mars as well. With the NASA CLPS missions with commercial landers, we're starting to deliver payloads to the surface of the Moon. And right now, it's very expensive, on the order of $1 million per kilogram. We want to decrease that with a more efficient infrastructure. There's also going to be a permanent platform around the Moon as well, the NASA Gateway, in an NRHO, near rectilinear halo orbit, where we'll start to see astronauts and cargo sit there in real time, becoming a stepping stone for either going to the surface of the Moon or going to Mars. And at Impulse Space, one of the things we're very passionate about is working with Relativity Space in partnership on the first commercial Mars lander mission. We're delivering cargo for commercial customers straight to the surface of Mars for the first time. And that's creating the commercial superhighway to Mars. Over time, it's not just going to be single one-off missions. We're going to start seeing the cementing of different types of hubs forming the backbone of the solar system transportation network. Around the Earth, you might see LEO and GEO as popular orbits, around the Moon, and around Mars. And this is the future that we need in order to sustainably travel in our solar system. If you now look back to where we started, to the Delta Airlines map, you're starting to see some very similar pieces of this puzzle. Let's replace some of these cities with now the major hubs in space: LEO, GEO, the Moon, Mars, and a frequent flight of transfer vehicles that can then take you from one destination to the other. I think the future of space exploration is going to be very exciting these days because compared to the Apollo missions of the 1960s, these aren't one-off, super expensive, government-only missions. We are opening this up to commercial space, to academia, international, and we're starting to create the first sustainable transportation infrastructure, allowing us to get not just to the Moon and Mars, but also beyond. And so my message to all of you today is, regardless of whatever you're working on in the space industry, whether it's communication satellites, lunar landers, there's always lessons to be learned by not just looking up, but looking down at the Earth. Because with thousands of years of problems solved, there's a lot you can learn from everyday life. Thank you.